I am Nia, 34 years old, and until recently, I was the woman my husband's elite Atlanta family loved to despise. At my husband's 35th birthday party, my mother-in-law asked our 6-year-old daughter to sit in a different room to make space for his real children. She literally pushed my little girl toward the kitchen doors. When my husband realized what was going on, he said something in front of everyone that made his parents go pale. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member. The air inside my mother-in-law's historic Buckhead mansion always felt heavy with the kind of old money arrogance that suffocates you the moment you walk through the door. The house was a multi-million-dollar monument to the legacy of a family that prided itself on 3 generations of historically Black college and university excellence. Everything from the crystal chandeliers casting a warm amber glow over the marble floors to the perfectly curated art collections screamed of elite African-American society. This was the world of Jack and Jill charity galas, exclusive country clubs, and relentless gatekeeping. It was a world I did not belong to, and my mother-in-law Corinne made sure I never forgot it. I grew up in the housing projects of Detroit. My path to success was paved with late-night shifts, community college loans, and a sheer refusal to remain invisible. When I met Marcus, he was immediately drawn to my drive and my lack of pretense. As the founder and CEO of a highly successful medical technology fund, Marcus had spent his entire life surrounded by people who only cared about his pedigree and his portfolio. I loved him for his heart, and he loved me for mine. But to Corinne, I was nothing more than an opportunistic outsider who had managed to trick her brilliant son into marriage. Worse than my zip code of origin was the fact that I came into the marriage with Zuri, my beautiful, vibrant 6-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. Marcus adored Zuri. He adopted her in his heart the moment we started dating and treated her with the kind of fierce, protective love that only a true father can provide. But in Corinne's eyes, Zuri was a permanent stain on their pristine family canvas, a daily reminder that her son had settled for what she called damaged goods. The true depth of Corinne's cruelty was not just in her snide remarks about my wardrobe or her deliberate exclusion of my name from the society event invitations. It was in her relentless championing of Chloe. Chloe was Marcus' former girlfriend, a woman whose bloodline met all of Corinne's ridiculous standards of perfection. She came from a family of prominent judges and surgeons, and she carried herself with the entitled swagger of someone who had never been told no. 7 years ago, Chloe and Marcus had a brief, tumultuous relationship that ended long before I ever entered the picture. But Chloe had a set of 7-year-old twins, and Corinne had enthusiastically decided they were Marcus' biological children. She paraded them around at every family function, treating them like the rightful heirs to the family throne while actively pretending my daughter did not exist. My brother-in-law Jamal and his arrogant wife Brittany would always join in on the mockery, exchanging knowing glances whenever Chloe was in the room. They all wanted me gone, and they were not subtle about it. The night of Marcus' 35th birthday party was supposed to be a celebration of his recent corporate victories, but Corinne had transformed it into a theatrical display of her social dominance. She had invited over 100 guests from Atlanta's most exclusive circles. Women dripping in diamonds and men in bespoke suits filled the grand living room, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I stood near the edge of the room, wearing a sleek emerald green gown, observing the calculated chaos. I held a glass of bourbon, letting the ice clink softly against the rim as I watched my mother-in-law work the room. She glided from group to group, her fake smile plastered on her face, leaning in to whisper comments that I knew were about me. I caught fragments of conversation about my inappropriate background and hushed gasps of feigned sympathy for Marcus having to raise another man's child. Through it all, I kept my composure for Marcus' sake. He was busy across the room, caught in a conversation with some of his primary investors, looking handsome and completely oblivious to the toxic undercurrents his mother was orchestrating. Zuri was standing nearby, clutching the hem of my dress, her wide eyes taking in the overwhelming crowd. She looked like a little princess in her white tulle dress, her hair perfectly braided and decorated with gold beads. She was so innocent, so entirely unaware of the malice radiating from the woman who was supposed to be her grandmother. I gently stroked her hair, reminding myself that her joy was worth enduring a few hours of these elitist snobs. Then Corinne played her trump card. The heavy mahogany doors to the grand foyer swung open and Chloe walked in holding the hands of her twins. She was dressed in an inappropriately flashy gown, looking less like a party guest and more like a woman arriving to claim a prize. Corinne immediately abandoned her conversation and rushed to greet them, making a loud, dramatic spectacle of kissing the twins and loudly proclaiming how beautiful her real grandchildren looked. Jamal and Brittany were right behind her, offering loud greetings and ushering Chloe further into the room. The entire party seemed to hold its breath watching this blatant display of disrespect. I tightened my grip on my glass, taking a slow sip of bourbon to keep my hands from shaking. I reminded myself that I had promised Marcus I would not cause a scene tonight. I promised I would be the bigger person. But Corinne was not interested in peace. As the evening progressed, the tension in the room grew thicker. The catered staff began carrying out a massive tiered birthday cake entirely custom-made to resemble the skyline of Atlanta. The guests started to gather around the grand dining table, their voices hushing as the staff lit the candles. Marcus smiled brightly and waved for me to join him at the head of the table. I took Zuri by the hand, and we began to walk forward. Zuri was practically vibrating with excitement, her little face glowing in the candlelight as she prepared to sing to the man she proudly called Dad. We were only a few feet away when Corinne suddenly stepped directly into our path, blocking us from Marcus. Her face was set in a rigid mask of pure spite. I stopped expecting another one of her passive-aggressive comments. Instead, she looked down at Zuri with an expression of absolute disgust. Without a single word of warning, she reached out and grabbed Zuri by the shoulder. Her grip was not gentle. It was forceful and physical, pushing my 6-year-old daughter backwards so hard that Zuri stumbled and nearly fell against a sharp marble side table. I gasped, lunging forward to catch my daughter before she could hit the ground. Zuri looked up at me, her eyes immediately filling with tears of confusion and fear. The chatter in the room instantly died. Every single guest turned to stare at the scene unfolding near the cake. The silence was absolute heavy and suffocating. You could hear the faint crackle of the birthday candles burning in the quiet room. Corinne did not even flinch. She straightened her pearl necklace and looked me dead in the eye, her voice loud enough to echo through the dead silent room. "Take your child and go into the kitchen," she commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the swinging doors that led to the catering area. "You and that girl can eat with the hired help where you belong. There is no space at this table for you. I need to clear the room so my son can celebrate properly with his real children." She gestured grandly toward Chloe and the twins who were now standing right next to Marcus. Chloe wore a triumphant smirk, looking down her nose at my crying daughter. Corinne turned her attention back to me, her tone dripping with absolute venom. "We have tolerated your presence long enough, Nia. But tonight is about family. Real elite family. Not whatever charity case project you dragged in from the streets of Detroit. Take your daughter and get out of sight before you embarrass my son any further." I knelt down, pulling Zuri into my chest, wrapping my arms around her trembling little shoulders. I could feel the heat radiating from my own skin, my blood boiling with a rage so intense it threatened to blind me. I had endured years of snide remarks, years of being excluded from photographs, years of subtle financial sabotage. I had swallowed my pride time and time again to keep the peace for the man I loved. But touching my child, crossing that physical line to humiliate a 6-year-old girl in front of hundreds of people, was the ultimate mistake. I stood up slowly, my eyes locking onto Corinne. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink. I simply stared at her, letting the absolute freezing calm of my anger settle over my features. In that fleeting second of silence, I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty cross her arrogant face. She had expected me to break down, to run away crying, or to scream like the uncultured stereotype she so desperately wanted me to be. She had no idea that beneath my polite demeanor, I had spent the last 3 years building an arsenal designed specifically for this exact moment. She had no idea that the woman she just ordered into the kitchen was about to dismantle her entire empire brick by brick. The air in the room crackled with an electric tension. The elite of Atlanta stood frozen, waiting for my response, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But my response was not going to be tears. It was going to be total annihilation. And the very first strike was not even going to come from me. It was going to come from the one person Corinne believed she controlled completely. I did not have to say a word because across the table, the sound of breaking crystal shattered the silence. Marcus had just slammed his champagne flute onto the floor. My muscles coiled tight, ready to strike back with a vengeance that would burn this entire mansion to the ground. I felt the heat rising in my chest, and my lips parted to deliver a verbal slaughter that Corinne would never forget. I was prepared to tear apart her elitist facade in front of every single judge, surgeon, and socialite in that room, but I never got the chance to say a single word. Before the first syllable could leave my mouth, a sharp, explosive crash shattered the suffocating silence of the room. It was not a delicate clink of silverware or a polite tap on a glass. It was the violent, unapologetic sound of expensive crystal being obliterated against imported Italian marble. Several women in the crowd gasped instinctively, taking a step back. I snapped my head up. Marcus stood at the far end of the grand dining table. The remaining stem of his champagne flute was still gripped tightly in his right hand. His knuckles were bone white. His jaw was clenched so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. The charming diplomatic CEO who had been effortlessly entertaining his investors just seconds ago was completely gone. In his place stood a furious protective father who had just watched his mother physically assault his little girl. He dropped the broken crystal stem. It hit the floor with a dull thud. It crunched beneath his polished leather dress shoes as he began to walk toward us. He moved with a slow, predatory deliberation. The crowd of Atlanta's most elite citizens parted immediately, scattering like frightened prey to clear a path for him. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to even breathe too loudly. They simply stared in shock as Marcus closed the distance. Corinne stood frozen, her manicured hand still hovering in the air from where she had shoved Zuri. She tried to maintain her haughty posture, lifting her chin and fixing a stern look on her face, as if she was preparing to scold him for breaking a glass. She opened her mouth, likely to spin her usual narrative about proper etiquette and traditional family values. Marcus did not let her speak. He stopped right beside me. He did not look at his mother yet. Instead, he knelt down right there in his bespoke suit, ignoring the dust on the marble floor. He placed a warm, heavy hand on Zuri's shoulder and gently pulled her away from my chest. He wiped a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You do not ever have to leave a room unless I tell you to," Marcus said to her, his voice firm and incredibly gentle. "You are my daughter. You belong exactly where I am." He stood up, tucking Zuri safely behind his legs. Then he turned his gaze to Corinne. I had never seen Marcus look at his mother like that in all the years we had been together. There was no respect left in his eyes. There was no filial piety. There was no hesitation. There was only absolute freezing contempt. He looked at her as if she were a stranger who had just wandered in off the street. "You just ordered my daughter into the kitchen," Marcus said. His voice was not a yell. It was a low, lethal whisper that carried perfectly across the dead, silent room, slicing through the tension like a razor blade. "You just put your hands on my child. You pushed the only legal heir I have and told her to make room for my real children." Corinne shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the guests who were hanging on to every word. "Marcus, darling," she started, trying to inject a tone of maternal patience into her voice. "You are causing a scene. I am simply trying to honor your bloodline. Chloe brought the twins all this way to celebrate you. It is only right that your biological children get to stand by your side when you cut your birthday cake." Marcus let out a dark, humorless laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored vest, He pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope bearing the logo of a highly secured private medical laboratory. He did not hand it to her politely. He threw it. The heavy envelope hit Corinne squarely in the chest with a loud smack. She gasped in shock as it bounced off her silk gown and dropped to the marble floor, landing right next to her designer heels. "You want to talk about real children," Mother Marcus demanded, stepping closer to her. "You want to talk about bloodlines and elite heritage. You want to talk about the precious biological twins you have been parading around my house and shoving in my wife's face for the past 3 years." He turned and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at his younger brother. Jamal was standing near the mahogany bar across the room, holding a drink he had forgotten to sip. The color instantly drained from Jamal's face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped in a tailored tuxedo. "You should probably ask my dear brother Jamal about that pure bloodline," Marcus announced to the crowd. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. I watched Jamal's eyes widen in sheer terror. Next to him, his wife Brittany, a woman who prided herself on her powerful political family background, suddenly stiffened. She turned her head slowly to look at her husband, confusion and dread washing over her features. Chloe, who had been standing next to the birthday cake with a triumphant smirk just moments ago, physically recoiled. She grabbed the hands of her twins and took a step back, her face flashing with pure panic. She shook her head slightly silently, pleading with Marcus not to continue. But Marcus was merciless. "I got the DNA results this afternoon," Marcus said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I had a private lab run the tests last week after I found some very interesting discrepancies in the family trust fund withdrawals. Those twins you love so much, Mother, the ones you claim have my superior genes, they belong to Jamal. They have always belonged to Jamal." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. You could literally hear the catered staff in the background stop moving. Dozens of eyes shifted rapidly between Marcus, Jamal, and Chloe. The resemblance suddenly became undeniable to everyone in the room. Corinne's mouth fell open. She looked down at the envelope on the floor and then looked at Jamal. Jamal could not even meet her gaze. He stared at the floor, his hands shaking so violently that the ice in his glass clattered against the sides. Brittany backed away from Jamal as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease, her face twisting into a mask of absolute fury and humiliation. "You have spent years treating my wife like garbage," Marcus said, turning his attention back to his mother. "You have spent years treating my daughter like a second-class citizen while you funded and protected my brother's mistress. You thought you could force your twisted version of a perfect family onto me." Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his movements calm and methodical, contrasting sharply with the total devastation he had just unleashed upon the room. So Marcus said, his tone turning brutally businesslike, "I hope you all enjoy this magnificent cake. Enjoy the expensive champagne. Enjoy the rest of this party. Because as of an hour ago, I officially dissolved my ties to this toxic family business. I have completely cut my name from the family trust fund. I have redirected every single cent of my personal wealth away from your control. You wanted an elite, pure bloodline, Mother. You have it. You and Jamal deserve exactly what is coming to you. Enjoy your meal, family." Marcus turned his back on her. He reached out and gently took my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. He looked down at Zuri and gave her a reassuring smile. Corinne's brain seemed to completely short-circuit. The matriarch of the family, the woman who ruled Atlanta society with an iron fist, could not process the total collapse of her empire. She looked at Chloe, who was now backing away toward the exit. She looked at Jamal, who was currently trying to grab a furious Brittany by the arm. She looked at the elite guests, who were now whispering frantically to one another, their faces filled with judgment and scandalous delight. Her breath hitched in her throat. She clutched at the pearls around her neck, her eyes rolling back into her head. Her knees buckled beneath her. Corinne collapsed in a heap of expensive silk, fainting right next to the discarded DNA envelope on the cold marble floor. Total pandemonium erupted. Women screamed. Jamal dropped his glass and rushed forward, pushing past the guests. Brittany ripped off her wedding ring, threw it at Jamal's chest, and stormed out the front door. The pristine elite birthday party devolved into absolute unhinged chaos. And as the family scrambled to revive their fallen queen, Marcus held my hand tightly and we walked away, leaving them to burn in the fire they had started. The grand double doors were only a few steps away, but Brittany stopped dead in her tracks. The instinct to flee to hide from the burning stares of Atlanta's elite was quickly eclipsed by a much darker, more familiar emotion. Absolute volcanic rage. She was a woman born into a ruthless political dynasty. Her father was a formidable state senator, and her entire existence had been meticulously curated for public office. Her family did not retreat when embarrassed. They retaliated with scorched earth. She spun around, her heavy designer gown sweeping the floor, and marched right back to the epicenter of the carnage. Jamal stood exactly where Marcus had left him, completely paralyzed. His tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He was sweating profusely, trembling as the sheer magnitude of his betrayal crashed down around him. For 7 long years he had played a dangerous, sickening game. He had built a pristine public image as the devoted, loyal husband to Brittany, the golden couple destined for the governor's mansion. But behind the scenes he had been systematically siphoning millions from the Wilson family trust fund. The money was never lost in bad investments, as he had always claimed. It was all for Chloe. 7 years of luxury penthouses, imported sports cars, and massive hush-money payments to keep his former mistress and his biological twins completely hidden from his powerful wife. Corinne had known the entire time, covering up his financial tracks because Jamal was her favorite, while allowing Marcus to shoulder the burden of the missing funds. Brittany lunged forward. She bypassed her hyperventilating husband and dropped to her knees beside Corinne's unconscious body. Her manicured fingers snatched the discarded DNA envelope from the cold marble. She ripped the heavy medical-grade paper apart, tearing it again and again with a primal ferocity until the certified results were reduced to meaningless shreds. She threw the pieces directly at Jamal's chest, letting them flutter to the ground like grotesque confetti. Jamal reached out, a pathetic whimper escaping his throat as he tried to grasp her arm. He opened his mouth to beg for forgiveness, to spin another web of lies, but Brittany did not let a single syllable materialize. She planted her feet and delivered a vicious backhanded slap across his face. The sharp cracking sound echoed violently above the gasps of the panicked guests. Jamal stumbled backward, his heavy frame crashing into the mahogany bar. He clutched his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes wide with sheer terror. The crowd of socialites and surgeons shrank back, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid the blast zone. In the corner, Chloe was hastily dragging her crying twins toward the service exit, desperate to escape the wrath of the scorned political heiress. But Brittany did not dissolve into tears. She did not scream about a divorce. In her world, public humiliation required a brutal, disproportionate destruction of the person who caused it. Her chest heaved, her eyes dark with a venomous fury. In her twisted mind, Jamal was a pathetic pawn, but Marcus was the true enemy. If Marcus had just kept his mouth shut, if he had just absorbed the blame and accepted the twins as his own, her perfect political world would have remained spotless. Marcus had dared to drag her pristine family name into the mud, and he was going to pay with his entire livelihood. She pulled her phone from her clutch, her hands remarkably steady for a woman whose marriage had just exploded. She hit a single speed dial number. The remaining guests seemed to hold their breath, watching the political scion wage war right in front of them. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with absolute ice, "we have a massive problem. The Wilsons just made a fool out of me in front of half the city." She paced the marble floor, stepping over the shredded DNA results, completely ignoring her mother-in-law, who was just beginning to groan and stir on the floor. "I do not care what political favors you have to call in," she ordered, her tone lethal and commanding. "I do not care which judges, bank executives, or federal regulators you have to wake up tonight. Marcus Wilson just threw a grenade into my campaign, and I want him obliterated. I want his entire logistics company frozen by tomorrow morning. I want every single one of his corporate accounts locked down pending a sudden SEC investigation. I want his supply chain severed and his contracts voided. I want his business bled dry before he even wakes up." She listened for a moment, her eyes locking onto Jamal, who was now openly weeping against the bar. Yes, she continued, her voice devoid of any human empathy. Destroy Marcus first. Then strip Jamal of everything. I want the trust fund audited. I want every dime he stole from this family exposed to the IRS. Ruin them both. As Brittany shoved the phone back into her clutch, a low moan broke the silence. Corinne was finally coming to. The matriarch fluttered her eyes open, disoriented and gasping for air. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her expensive pearls were tangled around her neck. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her vision blurring as she took in the sight of the shredded DNA test covering the marble floor like fresh snow. Brittany. Corinne gasped weakly, reaching a trembling hand toward her daughter-in-law. Please, you must not involve your father. We can handle this privately. I can explain everything. The family name must be protected. Brittany slowly turned her gaze down to the woman on the floor. The disgust radiating from her was palpable. She stepped closer, her stiletto heel coming mere inches from Corinne's outstretched fingers. You are going to explain everything. Brittany mocked, her voice slicing through the room with surgical precision. Are you going to explain how you sat at my dining table every Sunday for 7 years, smiling at me while you knew your favorite son was funding a secret family? Are you going to explain how you helped him launder millions of dollars through fake consulting fees just to protect his image at the expense of mine? Corinne's face drained of whatever color had managed to return. She stammered, struggling to find a lie that could save her, but the truth was already standing stark naked in the middle of the room. You are just as pathetic as he is, Brittany sneered, gesturing toward Jamal, who was still cowering against the bar. You thought you could control the narrative. You thought you could use my family's political leverage to elevate the Wilsons while treating me like a blind fool. My father is going to tear your precious empire apart piece by piece. By the time he is finished with the financial audits, there will not be a family name left to protect. You will be lucky if you are not sharing a prison cell with your son for tax evasion. Corinne let out a strangled cry, clutching her chest, as the reality of her total ruin settled in. The elite guests, the very people Corinne had spent decades trying to impress, were already slipping out the doors, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Brittany did not wait for a response. She adjusted the strap of her clutch, squared her shoulders, and walked out into the cool night air. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind her, with a resounding thud sealing the fate of the Wilson family. The morning sun crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse, but it brought absolutely no warmth. The fallout from the birthday party was not just swift. It was an orchestrated financial execution. By 7 in the morning, Marcus was barricaded in his home office. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, and the sound of ringing phones echoed relentlessly through the hallway. I stood in the kitchen pouring a glass of juice for Zuri, who was safely oblivious to the world collapsing around us. She was watching cartoons, her small legs kicking happily against the counter stool. I walked quietly toward the office. Marcus stood behind his desk, staring at 4 different computer monitors. The red lines on the financial graphs were plummeting in real time. His tie was discarded on a leather chair, and his sleeves were rolled up. He held his phone to his ear, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. Pull the contingency funds, he ordered, his voice a raspy, demanding baritone. All of them. I do not care if the penalty fees are steep. Transfer everything into the offshore holding accounts before the banks freeze them completely. He listened for a moment, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Senator Hayes got to them, he said, confirming my worst fears. Brittany had not been making empty threats. Her father had mobilized his entire political machine while we slept. Yes, I understand. The board invoked the morality clause. Let them withdraw. Tell the legal team to prepare for an SEC audit by noon. We are going to bleed today, but I want a tourniquet on the bleeding by sunset. Marcus slammed the phone down. He braced his hands on the edge of his desk, dropping his head. Decades of meticulous investing, endless nights of building his logistics firm from a subsidiary into an international powerhouse were being dismantled piece by piece. Brittany's father was utilizing every corrupt political favor, every dirty backroom handshake he had accumulated over a 30-year career to absolutely obliterate my husband. I took a step forward, wanting to wrap my arms around him, wanting to tell him that we would survive this. But before my foot could cross the threshold, my own cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out. The caller ID displayed a blocked number. A cold, dreadful intuition washed over me. I stepped back into the hallway, sliding the glass door shut to seal Zuri in the kitchen. I pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone completely neutral. "I hope you are enjoying the show, Nia," Karina's voice hissed through the speaker. It was not the weak, fainting tone of the woman who had collapsed on the marble floor the night before. This voice was pure, unadulterated venom. It was the sound of a desperate, cornered animal willing to chew off its own leg to survive. I did not respond. I just listened to her ragged breathing on the other end of the line. "Senator Hayes has frozen Marcus out of the primary distribution networks," Corinne continued, her words clipping with aristocratic precision. "3 of his biggest international investors pulled their capital at dawn. The banks are locking his domestic accounts as we speak. Jamal is currently sitting in my study crying like a child because his offshore accounts were seized by federal regulators at 5 in the morning. My family is bleeding out, and it is entirely your fault." "It is Jamal's fault for stealing," I replied, my voice as hard as steel. "It is your fault for covering it up. Do not project your rotting morality onto me, Corinne. You think you are so righteous," she snapped. "You think your little middle-class integrity matters against the kind of power Brittany's family wields. They will not stop until Marcus is bankrupt, disbarred, and facing federal prison time. Senator Hayes wants a body bag, and he does not care whose name is on the toe tag." "Then why are you calling me?" I asked, cutting straight through her dramatic monologue. "Because I can stop it," Corinne said. The desperation in her tone spiked. "I have leverage on the senator. Old money leverage. Favors his campaign owes the Wilson Trust. I can make a call right now and redirect the entire investigation onto Jamal alone. I can feed Jamal to the wolves and save Marcus. I can restore Marcus to the head of the trust fund and protect his company." She paused, letting the weight of her offer hang in the dead air between us. "But I will only do it on one condition," Corinne demanded. "You are going to pack your bags, Nia. You are going to take that little girl, and you are going to walk out the front door, and you are never going to look back. You will leave Atlanta. You will serve Marcus with divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences. You will vanish from our bloodline entirely." A dark laugh escaped my throat. "You want me to abandon my husband while he is under attack? If you actually love him, you will leave," Corinne spat back. "You will not let him lose his empire, his legacy, and his freedom just to play house with you. You are destroying him, Nia. Walk away right now, and I will throw him a life raft. Stay, and you will watch him drown." I gripped the phone tightly. I looked through the crack of the office door. Marcus was still standing there fighting a war against billionaires and politicians just to protect the truth. He had thrown away his entire inheritance last night without a single second of hesitation, simply because Corinne had disrespected our daughter. "I am not going anywhere, Corinne," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You can keep your life raft. Marcus and I know how to swim." I hung up the phone before she could scream another word. I blocked the number and slipped the device back into my pocket. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the home office. Marcus looked up. The exhaustion on his face was profound. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and the sharp lines of his jaw were tense with stress. He had lost millions in a matter of hours. The empire he had sacrificed his youth to build was currently burning to ash. I walked around the desk and stopped right in front of him. I reached up, resting my palms against his chest, feeling the rapid, steady beating of his heart. "Corinne just called me," I said, looking directly into his exhausted eyes. Marcus stiffened. His hands immediately came up to grip my waist, his protective instincts flaring instantly. "What did she say?" She said Brittany's father is trying to put you in federal prison, I replied, keeping my tone completely steady. She offered me a deal. She said if I pack my bags, take Zuri and divorce you today, she will use the family leverage to stop the senator. She said she would feed Jamal to the authorities to save your company, but only if I vanish. Marcus did not blink. His grip on my waist tightened until his fingers pressed firmly into my skin. A dark, dangerous fire ignited in his eyes, entirely consuming the exhaustion that had been there a second ago. "And what did you tell her?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I told her to keep her life raft," I said. Marcus let out a harsh breath that sounded almost like a laugh. He pulled me flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around me like an iron shield. He buried his face in my neck, breathing in the scent of my skin. "Let them burn it down," he whispered, his lips brushing against my collarbone. "Let Brittany's father call every bank. Let my mother try to manipulate the board. Let the entire Atlanta elite turn their backs on me. I do not care." He pulled back, holding my face in both of his hands. He looked at me with an intensity that made the rest of the crumbling world completely irrelevant. That company, that money, that trust fund, it was all a cage, Nia. It was a golden cage built on lies and stolen funds. I built my wealth once and I can build it 100 times over. But I will not do it without you. I will not sacrifice my wife and my daughter for a seat at a table with cowards and thieves. He kissed me hard, a bruising, desperate promise. "We are going to lose a lot of money today," Marcus said, resting his forehead against mine. "We are going to lose the penthouse. We might even have to fight federal subpoenas for the next 2 years. Are you ready for that?" I looked at my husband, the man who had burned his own family legacy to the ground just to keep our daughter safe. "I am ready," I said. "Let them come." Marcus nodded, his jaw set with a renewed determination. He grabbed his suit jacket and walked out of the office to meet with his legal defense team, leaving me alone in the sudden quiet of our penthouse. The silence was heavy, pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood perfectly still for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the city traffic far below. Atlanta was waking up. The elite circle of politicians and socialites were likely pouring their morning coffee, utterly convinced that they had just witnessed the permanent destruction of Marcus Wilson. They believed they held all the cards. They believed they were the untouchable gods of this city. I turned away from the window and walked down the long corridor toward my personal workspace. For 7 years, the Wilson family had maintained a unified, fiercely arrogant narrative about who I was. To Corinne, I was a parasite. To Brittany, I was a pathetic peasant completely out of my depth. At family dinners, they would smile with thinly veiled contempt, asking how my little bookkeeping business was doing. They thought I spent my days balancing checkbooks for local bakeries and filing tax returns for middle-class families. They called me a glorified calculator behind my back. They believed I was a financial nobody, incapable of comprehending the complex, sophisticated wealth of Atlanta's upper crust. They had no idea that their entire existence rested in the palm of my hand. I reached the end of the hallway and pushed open the door to my office. To the untrained eye, it was exactly what Corinne assumed it to be. A modest, boring room with a simple oak desk, a standard laptop, and walls lined with binders. I walked over to the large bookshelf that dominated the far wall. I reached behind a thick leather-bound volume on tax law and pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner flush against the wood. A soft chime echoed in the room. The entire bookshelf unlocked with a heavy mechanical click and slid smoothly to the left, revealing the true nature of my work. I stepped into a secondary room, bathed in the cool blue light of a massive server array. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, keeping the towers of processors from overheating. This was not the office of a local bookkeeper. This was the central nervous system of Apex Forensics. I was not just an accountant. I was the founder and lead investigator of an independent forensic auditing firm that served the FBI, the Department of Justice, and global financial intelligence agencies. When international cartels tried to wash their blood money through American real estate, the federal government called me. When corrupt state senators tried to hide illicit campaign contributions in offshore shell companies, the intelligence community contracted Apex Forensics to follow the digital breadcrumbs. I did not just read spreadsheets. I dismantled criminal empires using mathematics and code. And currently, my heavily encrypted servers held the black money trails of over half of Atlanta's elite, including the very people who were trying to destroy my husband. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair positioned in front of a massive curved console. I woke the system up. 6 ultra-wide monitors flared to life simultaneously, casting a bright, aggressive glow across my face. The cinematic hum of the supercomputer vibrating through the floorboards felt like the beating heart of a predator waking from a long slumber. If a camera were to circle around me right now in a slow, continuous 360-degree pan, it would capture a woman transforming from a targeted victim into a lethal executioner. The soft, dutiful wife was gone. The apex predator had taken the wheel. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. I did not need to hack into the Wilson Trust Fund. I did not need to break into Senator Hayes' political action committees. I already had federal backdoor access to the banking networks they used. They were arrogant enough to believe their wealth was invisible, protected by expensive lawyers and complicated corporate structures. But money always leaves a footprint. I cracked my knuckles and began to type. The keystrokes echoed like rapid gunfire in the chilled air of the server room. First, I targeted Jamal, the golden boy who had cowered behind his mother's skirt while his brother took the fall. I bypassed the standard firewalls of his domestic banks and pulled up the master ledger of the Wilson Family Trust. Jamal thought he was a genius for using dummy corporations in Delaware to siphon the funds. I mapped his entire network in less than 4 minutes. The screen populated with a dizzying web of red lines connecting his trust withdrawals to a series of shell companies. I traced the money flowing from those companies directly into the Cayman Island accounts, held under Chloe's maiden name. 7 years of luxury penthouses, imported vehicles, and massive cash transfers. Jamal had left a digital trail so wide and sloppy, it was practically begging for a federal indictment. I isolated every single fraudulent wire transfer, downloaded the metadata, and compiled a heavily encrypted dossier labeled Exhibit A. Next, I moved to Corinne, the matriarch who had called me a parasite and threatened to destroy my husband if I did not vanish. I opened a new terminal window and ran a deep diagnostic on her personal wealth management accounts. Corinne was smarter than Jamal, but she suffered from the same terminal arrogance. She had actively authorized the laundering of the trust funds to protect Jamal, manipulating the family's tax returns to hide the missing millions from the IRS. I found the falsified audit reports she had signed. I found the offshore accounts where she had buried her own untaxed dividends to avoid federal scrutiny. She had committed textbook tax evasion and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. With a few swift keystrokes, I mirrored her entire financial history and secured it in a file labeled Exhibit B. Corinne was going to spend her twilight years in a federal penitentiary, and I was going to hand the FBI the keys to her cell. Finally, I turned my crosshairs onto the biggest target of the morning. Senator Hayes, Brittany's ruthless, powerful father, who had orchestrated the massive coordinated attack on Marcus Logistics Company. He thought he could freeze my husband's assets with a few phone calls to his corrupt banking buddies. He thought he could weaponize his political office to destroy an innocent man without facing any retaliation. I opened my most restricted federal database. This was the digital vault where I stored the most sensitive investigations. I typed in the senator's name and hit enter. The screens exploded with data. Senator Hayes was a walking, breathing criminal enterprise. I bypassed his public campaign finance records and drilled straight into his dark money super PACs. I cross-referenced his political donors with international shell companies based in Panama and Switzerland. The results were absolutely devastating. The senator had been accepting millions in illegal offshore campaign contributions from foreign entities in exchange for passing favorable state legislation. He had used a complex web of real estate holding companies to wash the bribes, pretending the money came from legitimate domestic investors. I watched the digital map connect the dots. The senator's dirty money flowed through the exact same corrupt banking executives he had just used to freeze Marcus accounts. It was a beautiful, poetic symmetry. The weapon he used to strike my husband was the exact same weapon I was going to use to bury him. I did not just compile a file on the senator. I packaged his entire criminal history into an automated federal reporting protocol. I linked his offshore accounts, his fraudulent real estate holdings, and his illegal campaign contributions into a single, undeniable package. I tied his financial crimes directly to the banking executives who had unlawfully locked Marcus Company accounts, proving a massive coordinated conspiracy. I leaned back in my chair, the cool blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The entire network of Atlanta's untouchable elite was laid bare across my screens. They had spent years treating me like I was invisible. They had pushed me to the absolute edge, assuming I would simply break and run away. They had attacked the only man who had ever stood up to their toxicity. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I reached out and placed my finger over the enter key. The dossiers were complete. The evidence was irrefutable. I was not just going to clear Marcus' name, I was going to initiate a financial massacre that would make national headlines by lunchtime. The SEC, the IRS, and the FBI were about to receive an anonymous, heavily encrypted data dump that would trigger immediate federal raids on the Wilson estate and Senator Hayes' political offices. My hand froze over the keyboard. It was a background extraction algorithm I had set to run on the peripheral accounts of the Wilson estate. While I had been dismantling Senator Hayes and Jamal's primary networks, the deep dive protocol had been silently chewing through decades of the family's philanthropic tax filings. A massive red flag was currently flashing across my secondary monitor, demanding immediate attention. I pulled the window to the center screen. The anomaly was buried beneath layers of encrypted corporate jargon, but my eyes caught the discrepancy instantly. It was the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Scholarship Fund. This was Corinne's crown jewel. She paraded this specific charity at every gala, using the promise of funding underprivileged youth to secure her spot at the very top of Atlanta's social hierarchy. But the ledger was bleeding. I cracked my neck and dove into the routing numbers. The money was not just missing. It was being systematically diverted through a phantom vendor listed as a consulting firm. I bypassed the vendor firewall in less than 60 seconds. The digital trail did not lead to Jamal. It completely bypassed his sloppy offshore accounts and bypassed Corinne's tax havens. The money was being funneled into a hyper-secure black safe account located in the Cayman Islands. I ran a biometric cross-reference on the Cayman Accounts Holding Company. The screen rendered the true owner in bold white lettering, Brittany Hayes. I sat back in my leather chair, the sheer magnitude of the deception washing over me. Brittany was not the humiliated, innocent wife. She was the architect of an entirely different kind of extortion. I dug deeper, pulling the encrypted text messages and deleted email logs between Brittany and Jamal over the past 3 years. The picture painted by the data was absolutely sickening. Brittany had known about Chloe and the twins for years. She had hired her own private investigators long before Marcus ever dropped the DNA envelope on the floor. But instead of filing for divorce and risking the public scandal that would ruin her father's political campaigns, she had weaponized the secret. Brittany had cornered Jamal and bled him dry. She had demanded millions in hush money to play the role of the devoted political wife. When Jamal ran out of his own liquid assets to steal, she had forced him to start embezzling directly from his mother's prized HBCU charity. Every time Corinne smiled for the cameras and handed out a scholarship, Brittany was siphoning 10 times that amount into her Cayman black safe. The golden couple was nothing more than a parasitic hostage situation. The federal raids I had initiated would take hours to physically materialize, but I did not want to wait for the FBI to shatter their illusion of control. I wanted psychological warfare. I wanted them to tear each other to pieces from the inside out before the sirens ever reached their front gates. I isolated the Cayman Island bank statements. I compiled the black safe routing numbers, the offshore balances, and the direct blackmail emails where Brittany explicitly threatened to expose the twins if Jamal did not wire the charity funds. I packaged the entire unholy truth into a single undeniable PDF file. I did not send it to the authorities. I sent it directly to the enemy. I bypassed the security network of the Wilson family mansion, mapping the IP addresses of every device in the house. I located the private high-speed laser printer sitting in Corinne's mahogany-lined study. With a final keystroke, I forced a remote print command. I sat in the cold blue light of my server room and tapped into the internal audio feed of the mansion's security system, piping the live sound directly into my headset. Miles away in the sprawling Wilson estate, the printer whirred to life. Through the audio feed, I could hear the frantic pacing of Corinne. She was already in a state of sheer panic, screaming at her wealth managers over the phone, as the frozen accounts and plummeting stock prices began to choke her reality. I heard the phone slam down. I heard her sharp breaths. And then I heard the crisp sound of the printer spitting out page after page of financial ruin. There was a long, agonizing silence. I pictured Corinne stepping up to the tray, picking up the warm pages. I heard the sharp intake of breath. I heard a guttural sound of pure primal shock escape her throat. Brittany, the matriarch, screamed. The sound echoed through the massive empty halls of the mansion. It was not a call. It was a battle cry. Brittany, get down here right now. Get down here, right? I adjusted my headset, leaning closer to the monitors. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded down the grand staircase. Brittany burst into the study, her voice tight with aristocratic fury. "Why are you screaming like a madwoman?" Brittany snapped. "My father is trying to fix the mess your pathetic son created. The bank regulators are not backing off, Corinne. My father said someone locked the federal overrides. What did you do?" Corinne did not answer. The audio feed picked up the sound of heavy paper being violently thrown across the room, hitting Brittany right in the chest. "What did I do?" Corinne hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying rage. "The question is, what did you do, you parasitic little leech? Look at those papers. Look at them." I heard the rustle of paper as Brittany picked up the Cayman statements. The sudden silence from the political heiress was absolute perfection. The mask of the wronged woman disintegrated in an instant. You knew Corinne's voice was shaking a dangerous mix of heartbreak and homicidal fury. You knew about that wretched woman and those bastard twins. You played the victim last night in front of the entire city. You let my son humiliate this family, and all this time you were extorting him. You forced Jamal to steal from my charity. You stole from the scholarship funds. You stole from my legacy to line your own offshore vaults. The pause that followed was thick with venom. When Brittany finally spoke, the panicked politician's daughter was gone. The voice that echoed through the hidden microphone was cold, dead, and utterly remorseless. "Your legacy." Brittany scoffed, a dark, cruel laugh escaping her lips. "Your legacy is a joke, Corinne. It is a pathetic, desperate attempt to buy class. Jamal is a weak, spineless fool who could not keep his pants zipped. He jeopardized my future. He jeopardized my father's gubernatorial run. Did you really think I was going to walk away with nothing while you protected your precious golden boy? I took exactly what I was owed for playing the part of his loving wife." "You embezzled millions of dollars!" Corinne screamed, her composure completely snapping. "I will destroy you. I will hand these papers to the press myself. I will ruin your father's campaign, and I will see you rot in a federal prison." Brittany laughed again, louder this time. "You are not going to do a single thing, Corinne. Who do you think you are talking to? If you release those papers, you expose the fact that your own charity is a massive fraud. You expose the fact that your favorite son is a criminal mastermind who stole from underprivileged kids to pay off his mistresses and his wife. If I go down, the Wilson name goes down with me. You will be universally despised. The country clubs will ban you. The galas will blacklist you. You will be a pariah in this city." I heard the sound of glass shattering as Corinne swept a crystal decanter off her desk in a blind rage. "You underestimated me, Corinne." Brittany continued, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You always treated me like a pretty little accessory. But I am a haze. We do not lose. You are going to fix whatever is happening with the banks right now. You are going to protect my Cayman accounts, and you are going to find a way to pin every single missing dollar from that charity onto Marcus. If you try to pin this on Marcus, he will release everything." Corinne fired back, her breathing ragged. "He does not care about the family name anymore. Nia has poisoned him against us." "Then we eliminate Nia." Brittany said, the utter ruthlessness in her tone making my blood run cold. "She is the weak link. If we break her, we break Marcus." Sitting in the glow of my server room, I smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. They were rats trapped in a sinking barrel, biting each other to survive, completely unaware that the ship had already plunged beneath the surface. They thought they still had moves to play. They thought they could still manipulate the board. They had no idea that the FBI Financial Crimes Unit was currently coordinating a strike team to hit their locations. I pulled my headset off and let it rest around my neck. I reached for my phone and dialed Marcus' private number. He answered on the first ring, the background noise of his legal team buzzing behind him. "Are you safe?" Marcus asked, his voice instantly shifting to that low, protective register. "I am perfectly safe," I said, my eyes scanning the endless lines of code that had just sealed the fate of the Atlanta elite. "But you should probably tell your lawyers to turn on the news. The Wilson Empire is about to be raided, and your mother and Brittany are currently in the study planning to frame you for charity fraud." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Marcus let out a dark, familiar chuckle. "You found the Cayman accounts, did not you?" he asked. "I found everything," I replied. "I found the blackmail. I found the theft. I sent it directly to Corinna's printer. They are eating each other alive, Marcus." "Good," he said, his voice hard and resolute. "Let them choke on it. I am coming home, Nia. Lock the doors." I terminated the call and leaned back into the leather chair. The sun was fully up now, piercing through the sliver of the open bookshelf door. The city was awake, but the predators who usually ran it were bleeding out. I had pulled the strings. I had set the trap. Now all that was left was to watch the federal government deliver the final devastating blow. The federal vehicles had barely cleared the Wilson estate driveway before the surviving predators began to orchestrate their final desperate strike. The raids had been absolute and devastating. Black SUVs had swarmed both the mansion and Senator Hayes's political headquarters simultaneously. Agents had seized servers, boxed up physical ledgers, and frozen every domestic account tied to the Wilson name. But in the ruthless ecosystem of Atlanta's elite wealth was only half the equation. Social capital was the other, and it took much longer to bleed out. Corinne and Brittany found themselves sitting across from each other in the dimly lit, soundproofed conference room of a high-priced defense attorney. Just 12 hours prior, they had been at each other's throats, tearing apart the family legacy in Corinne's study. Now stripped of their offshore safety nets and facing imminent federal indictments, they recognized a terrifying reality. They had been completely outplayed by the woman they considered a nobody. The sheer humiliation of being dismantled by a middle-class accountant forged an unholy alliance between them. Their mutual hatred was temporarily eclipsed by a burning, venomous desire to inflict maximum pain on Nia. If they were going down, they were determined to take her heart and soul with them. Brittany paced the length of the conference room, her designer heels sinking into the plush carpet. Her campaign manager had just resigned, and her father was currently barricaded in his office, refusing to take her calls. She turned to Corinne, her eyes cold and calculating. "We cannot touch Marcus." Brittany stated, her voice flat. "He legally severed his ties to the trust fund before the SEC moved in. And Nia has insulated herself behind federal firewalls. But they have a weak point. They always have a weak point." Corinne looked up from the mahogany table, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly from the stress of the morning. "Zuri," she whispered. The name hung in the air, a dark and twisted target. Zuri was only 6 years old, but in their eyes she was a weapon. The little girl attended the Sterling Academy, the most prestigious and fiercely guarded private institution in the entire state. Admission to Sterling was not just about money. It was about bloodline's legacy and the absolute approval of the parent board. Corinne had sat on that board for 15 years. Brittany's father was one of the school's largest anonymous benefactors. "They are stripping us of our dignity," Brittany said, a cruel smile slowly forming on her lips. "So we strip them of theirs. I want that child humiliated. I want her expelled today." Corinne did not hesitate. The maternal instinct she claimed to possess had never extended to Marcus's daughter. She pulled her phone from her purse and dialed the private line of Headmaster Arthur Pendleton. She did not request a meeting, she issued a mandate. She reminded the headmaster that the Wilson and Hayes families still controlled the endowment fund network regardless of the morning's news cycle. She demanded that Zuri be removed from the premises, immediately citing a violation of the school's strict morality and cultural standards clause. Less than an hour later, Nia was standing in the kitchen of her penthouse, packing a small lunchbox, when her phone rang. The caller ID displayed the crest of Sterling Academy. She answered, expecting a standard update from the school nurse or a teacher. Instead, the wavering voice of the headmaster's secretary requested her immediate presence on campus. The secretary refused to provide details, only stating that an emergency administrative decision had been made regarding Zuri's enrollment. Nia felt the air rush out of her lungs. The high from the morning's victory evaporated, replaced by a fierce, primal panic. She left the lunchbox on the counter, grabbed her keys, and sprinted to the elevator. The drive to the academy took 20 minutes, but to Nia, it felt like an eternity. The Sterling Academy campus looked like a small Ivy League college with its towering brick facades, sweeping green lawns, and wrought iron gates. Nia bypassed the visitor parking and pulled her car directly into the circular driveway designated for administration. She marched through the heavy oak doors, her eyes dark and focused. The receptionist shrank back at the sight of her, pointing a trembling finger toward the headmaster's office. Nia did not bother knocking. She pushed the heavy double doors open with enough force that they slammed against the interior walls. Headmaster Pendleton jumped in his leather chair, dropping a gold-plated pen onto his desk. He was a small, nervous man who had spent his entire career bowing to the whims of the wealthy. Sitting in the two guest chairs opposite him were Corinne and Brittany. They had rushed to the school to witness the execution in person. "Where is my daughter?" Nia demanded, ignoring the two women completely and locking her gaze onto the headmaster. Pendleton cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. He refused to look her in the eye. "Mrs. Wilson." He began, his voice carrying a practiced, condescending tone. "We have secured your daughter in the library with a chaperone. We felt it best to remove her from the classroom before the other students became aware of the situation." "What situation?" Nia asked, stepping closer to the desk. The temperature in the room plummeted. Brittany turned in her chair, a smug, satisfied expression plastered across her face. "The situation, Nia, is that Sterling Academy is an institution of prestige and irreproachable character. The board has held an emergency vote. Given the scandalous nature of your family's current public standing and the questionable background of your sudden marriage to Marcus, the board has determined that Zuri no longer fits the culture of this institution. Her scholarship has been revoked, and her enrollment is effectively terminated." Corinne smiled, leaning back and crossing her legs. "We simply cannot have the other children exposed to that kind of environment. You understand, do you not? You can take your daughter back to whatever public school district you crawled out of." Nia stood perfectly still. The sheer audacity of their cruelty was breathtaking. They had lost their millions, their political power, and their reputations. Yet they were sitting here trying to exert power over a 6-year-old child. Pendleton finally found the courage to speak up. "I am sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but the board's decision is final. We will have a staff member escort you to the library so you can collect her things quietly. We expect you to leave the premises without causing a disruption." Nia did not yell. She did not cry. The soft accountant they thought they had cornered did not exist. She walked slowly to the edge of the headmaster's desk, placed her hands flat on the polished wood, and leaned in. "You think you have the moral high ground here?" Nia said, her voice a low, terrifying hum. "You sit in this expensive office preaching about character while taking orders from two women who are currently facing federal indictments for wire fraud, tax evasion, and extortion." Pendleton blanched his eyes, darting nervously toward Corinne. "I have no knowledge of any criminal investigations. I simply follow the directives of the endowment board." "That is exactly the problem," Arthur, Nia said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. "You follow the money, and you are too stupid to realize that the money is dirty." She pulled her tablet from her bag and slapped it face up on the desk. She tapped the screen, entering a rapid sequence of commands. The screen flared to life, displaying the internal routing ledgers for Sterling Academy's endowment fund. "I run Apex Forensics," Nia stated, calmly, watching the color drain completely from Brittany's face. I am the lead federal auditor tracking the Wilson Trust Fund. And since you decided to bring my daughter into your pathetic little war, I decided to take a look at your school's finances on my drive over here. She slid the tablet toward the headmaster. He looked down, his hands beginning to shake uncontrollably. Your prestigious board has been using the school's charitable status to wash illegal campaign contributions for Senator Hayes. Nia explained, her voice echoing like a judge delivering a sentence. Over $4 million have passed through your athletic department's renovation budget straight into offshore accounts. You signed those transfer authorizations, Arthur. You authorized the laundering of federal funds under the guise of private education. Pendleton gasped, clutching his chest as he stared at the undeniable proof of his own federal crimes. Brittany stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. You cannot use that information, she shouted, her voice cracking with actual fear. That data is illegally obtained. I have a federal warrant for every financial network tied to the Hayes family, Nia replied, turning her cold, dead gaze onto Brittany. I can use whatever I want. And right now, I am looking at a headmaster who is going to serve 10 years for money laundering and a school board that is going to be completely dismantled by the Department of Justice before the end of the semester. Corinne sat frozen in her chair, her mouth opening and closing silently. The temporary truce, the arrogant plan to humiliate Zuri, had backfired with catastrophic precision. They had inadvertently handed Nia the keys to destroy their last remaining sanctuary of power. Nia picked up her tablet and slipped it back into her bag. She looked down at the terrified headmaster. You do not need to expel my daughter, Nia said, her tone dripping with absolute finality. I am withdrawing her. I would never allow my child to be educated in a facility run by cowards and criminals. But do not think for a second that this conversation ends here. I am sending this entire ledger to the federal prosecutor overseeing the Hayes investigation. She turned her back on the desk and walked toward the heavy double doors. Before she stepped out, she looked over her shoulder at Corinne and Brittany, who were now sitting in silence, the absolute crushing reality of their total destruction finally taking hold. I told you to keep your life raft, Corinne, Nia said softly. Now you can both drown. Nia walked out of the office, leaving the doors wide open behind her. She marched down the pristine hallway toward the library, her head held high. She found Zuri sitting at a small wooden table, coloring a picture of a rocket ship, completely unaware of the war that had just been fought for her dignity. Nia knelt down, wrapping her arms tightly around her daughter. She picked Zuri up, holding her close to her chest, and walked out of the Sterling Academy for the very last time, stepping out into the bright, unfiltered sunlight of a brand new day. I buckled Zuri into her car seat, handing her a fresh juice box and a tablet loaded with her favorite cartoons. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her mother had just declared war on the most powerful institution in the state. I kissed her forehead, closed the heavy door, and climbed into the driver's seat. The adrenaline from the headmaster's office was still coursing through my veins, but it was quickly solidifying into a cold, calculated focus. Walking away was only the first step. Corinne and Brittany thought they could use Zuri as a pawn to inflict emotional damage. They thought withdrawing my daughter was a retreat. They were entirely mistaken. It was a tactical repositioning. I pulled out of the Sterling Academy gates and drove straight to the Apex Forensics downtown headquarters. I needed my primary terminal. The federal raids were already tearing apart the Hayes and Wilson financial networks, but Corinne still held her social armor. Sterling Academy was the epicenter of her societal power. It was where she networked, where she judged the lesser families, and where she derived her false sense of superiority. That armor needed to be shattered into a million pieces. I escorted Zuri into my private suite at the office, where my trusted assistant Maria immediately set up a makeshift art station for her. Once Zuri was happily occupied with a fresh set of markers, I walked into my glass-walled command center and locked the door. I fired up my terminal. Sterling Academy was a non-profit entity, but the sprawling 50-acre estate it sat on was not. The land was leased. It was a classic wealth preservation tactic used by the Atlanta elite. The property was owned by a private commercial real estate investment trust called the Vanguard Heritage Group. For decades, Vanguard had leased the land to the school at a heavily subsidized rate, ensuring the institution remained untouchable and exclusive. But Vanguard Heritage Group was a publicly traded entity on the private equity markets, and thanks to the massive federal raids I had triggered that morning, the Atlanta financial sector was currently in a state of absolute freefall. Investors were panicking. Portfolios tied to the Hayes political machine were shedding value by the second. Vanguard was heavily backed by those exact portfolios. I opened a direct encrypted line to my primary broker in New York. I did not need to ask for permission or secure a loan. Apex Forensics had an acquisitions arm funded by years of high-level international auditing bounties. I had millions in liquid capital ready to deploy at a moment's notice. I instructed my broker to execute a hostile takeover. I wanted 51% of Vanguard Heritage Group, and I wanted it within the hour. The market panic worked perfectly in my favor. Terrified board members and institutional investors were dumping their shares, attempting to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Senator Hayes scandal. My automated trading algorithm swept in, devouring the shares at a premium before anyone even realized what was happening. In exactly 42 minutes, the progress bar on my screen hit 100%. The digital certificates locked into my secure vault. I was now the majority owner of the land beneath Sterling Academy. I owned their manicured football fields. I owned their pristine brick buildings. I owned the very ground Corinne Wilson stood on. I did not waste a single second. As the majority shareholder, I possessed the unilateral authority to trigger the emergency reassessment clause in the commercial land lease. I drafted a formal legal directive from the Vanguard Heritage Group addressed directly to the Sterling Academy Board of Directors. The notice was brief and devastating. Effective immediately, the subsidized lease agreement was terminated. The new monthly rent for the 50-acre campus was increased by 300%. Failure to agree to the new terms within 24 hours would result in an immediate eviction notice and the seizure of all physical assets on the property. I hit send, then I leaned back in my chair watching the delivery confirmation flash across the screen. The fallout was instantaneous. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone began to light up. I ignored the calls, tapping into the school's internal communication network instead. The panic inside the Sterling Academy boardroom was absolute and total. Headmaster Pendleton had forwarded my email to the board of directors, and the entire wealthy elite of Atlanta were suddenly facing the complete destruction of their prized institution. They could not afford a 300% rent increase. The school would be bankrupt in a matter of months. The board members frantically traced the sudden acquisition. It did not take them long to bypass the Vanguard shell companies and find the true owner, Apex Forensics. The name stared back at them, undeniable and absolute. They realized instantly what had happened. They knew who I was. They also knew exactly who was responsible for bringing my wrath to their doorstep. I logged into the secure video conferencing platform used by the Sterling Board. As the majority landowner, I had the legal right to audit their emergency sessions. I appeared on the massive digital screen at the head of their boardroom, my face calm and utterly devoid of mercy. The room was in total chaos. 12 of Atlanta's most powerful men and women were shouting over one another. Corinne Wilson was seated near the center of the mahogany table, her face flushed red as she tried to defend herself over the escalating noise. "This is an illegal extortion attempt," Corinne shrieked, pounding her manicured fist on the table. "We will sue her. We will tie this up in litigation for years. You will do no such thing." The board chairman, a ruthless banking magnate named Richard Sterling, roared back at her. His face was purple with rage. "Do you understand what you have done, Corinne? You used this school to execute a petty personal vendetta against Marcus' wife. You authorized Pendleton to expel her daughter without consulting the full board. And now she owns the ground under our feet." "She is bluffing," Corinne snapped, her voice trembling as she looked around the room for support that was no longer there. "She does not have the power to evict us." "I assure you, Corinne, I am not bluffing." My voice echoed through the boardroom speakers, cutting through the shouting like a blade. Every head in the room snapped toward the digital screen. Corinne shrank back in her chair, the remaining color draining from her face as she looked at me. "I own 51% of Vanguard Heritage." I stated, my tone clinical and detached. I have the legal right to liquidate the property, repurpose it, or bulldoze your pristine library to build a commercial parking lot. Your lease is void. The 300% increase is non-negotiable. You provoked me. You targeted a 6-year-old child to satisfy your own bruised ego. This is the consequence. The board chairman stood up, his hands pleadingly raised toward the screen. Mrs. Wilson. Nia, please. We had no prior knowledge of Corinne's actions. Pendleton acted under duress. We are begging you to reconsider the lease terms. This school is a historic institution. You cannot punish hundreds of innocent students for the actions of one arrogant woman. I watched them squirm. These were the people who had looked down on me at charity galas. The people who had laughed at Corinne's jokes about my bookkeeping business. Now they were practically on their knees begging a glorified calculator for mercy. I will consider renegotiating the lease, I said, slowly letting the silence stretch to amplify their desperation. Under 2 conditions. Name them, Richard Sterling said, instantly abandoning Corinne without a single second of hesitation. Condition 1. I said, my eyes locking directly onto Corinne's terrified face on the monitor. Corinne Wilson is to be stripped of her honorary board membership immediately. She is permanently banned from the Sterling Academy campus. Her name is to be removed from the library wing, and she will never be permitted to attend another school function gala or administrative meeting for the rest of her natural life. Corinne gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Richard, you cannot do this, she pleaded, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. I built that library. My family has funded this school for decades. Your family is currently being raided by the FBI. Richard shot back, his voice dripping with disgust. You are toxic, Corinne. You have brought a federal auditor to our doorstep and nearly bankrupted this academy in a single afternoon. You are finished here. He turned back to the screen, looking directly at my video feed. Your first condition is accepted, Mrs. Wilson. Corinne is officially expelled from the board. Security will escort her from the premises the moment this meeting concludes. What is your second condition? I smiled a cold, hard smile. Condition 2. You will initiate a full internal audit of Headmaster Pendleton's financial authorizations, specifically regarding his dealings with Senator Hayes' political action committees. You will hand those findings over to the authorities, and you will terminate his employment before sunset. Pendleton, who had been cowering in the corner of the room, let out a pathetic whimper and buried his face in his hands. He knew his career was over. He knew he was going to prison. We agree, Richard Sterling said without hesitation. The board accepts your terms in full. We will draft the termination and expulsion notices immediately. We humbly ask for your forgiveness regarding the treatment of your daughter. My daughter will not be returning to your institution, I replied, shutting down his attempt at reconciliation. I simply wanted to ensure that the people responsible for targeting her understood exactly who they were dealing with. Do not ever mistake my silence for weakness again. I severed the connection, the screen going black. I leaned back in my chair, the heavy silence of my office wrapping around me. The social execution was complete. Corinne Wilson had just been publicly humiliated and excommunicated from the very epicenter of her high society life. Her friends had turned on her. Her power was gone. She was no longer the untouchable matriarch of Atlanta. She was a liability, a pariah being escorted out of a building by security guards while her peers watched in disgust. I stood up from my terminal and walked out into the private suite. Zuri looked up from her coloring book, offering me a bright missing tooth smile. She held up a drawing of a rocket ship colored in vibrant shades of purple and gold. Look, Mommy, it is going to the moon, she said proudly. I crouched down and pulled her into a tight hug, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. It is beautiful, baby, I whispered, holding her close. The war was not entirely over, but the heaviest artillery had been dropped. I had systematically dismantled their wealth, their political safety nets, and their social empires. They had tried to push me into the shadows, but instead they had forced me to burn their entire world to the ground. 3 days passed in a strange, suffocating quiet. The federal agencies were methodically ripping through the Wilson and Hayes estates, executing search warrants and freezing peripheral assets, but the high society machine of Atlanta moved at its own stubborn pace. Corinne and Brittany were wounded, bleeding from 1,000 financial cuts, but they were not yet dead. And a cornered animal is always the most unpredictable. It was a Thursday afternoon when the courier arrived at our private elevator bank. Maria, my assistant, accepted the package and brought it to the kitchen island where Marcus and I were reviewing the latest legal filings from his corporate attorneys. The envelope was thick, heavy, midnight black cardstock embossed with a gold foil crest. It did not bear a return address, but the heavy scent of expensive floral perfume clinging to the paper told me exactly who had sent it. I reached out and slid my manicured fingernail under the gold wax seal. Inside was a formal invitation to the Atlanta Heritage Foundation Autumn Gala. It was the most exclusive, highly anticipated charity ball of the season. For decades, it had been co-hosted by the Hayes and Wilson families. It was their ultimate stage, a room filled with billionaires, politicians, and global investors, where they laundered their public image and secured their dark money under the guise of philanthropy. But it was not the invitation itself that caught my attention. Clipped to the front of the heavy cardstock was a small piece of personalized stationery. The handwriting was sharp, aggressive, and rushed. I held it up to the light and read the words silently. "Come to clear the tables, just like how you clean up your pathetic life. Brittany." She was unraveling. The psychological pressure of the impending indictments, the loss of her Cayman accounts, and the absolute humiliation of Corinne being thrown out of Sterling Academy had driven her to a state of sheer manic desperation. She had sent this invitation as a taunt, a venomous lash-out from a woman who still fundamentally believed she was untouchable. In her fractured mind, she thought inviting me to her arena would break me. She expected me to cower, to feel small in a room full of generational wealth. She wanted me to know that despite everything I had done, she still controlled the social hierarchy. Marcus noticed the shift in my posture. He set down his coffee mug and reached across the marble island, taking the note from my hand. His dark eyes scanned the aggressive cursive lettering. Instantly, the muscles in his jaw locked. The veins in his neck tightened as a wave of pure, unadulterated fury rolled off his broad shoulders. He did not say a word. He just gripped the thick cardstock in both hands, his knuckles turning white, preparing to rip the invitation and the arrogant note into 100 tiny pieces. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his. "Do not ruin a perfectly good invitation, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a protective rage. "Nia, she is baiting you. She is a desperate lunatic trying to humiliate you in front of the entire city. I am not letting you walk into a room full of vipers just so Brittany Hayes can try to claw back her pathetic dignity. We throw this in the trash. We let the FBI arrest her by the end of the week." I gently pulled the invitation from his grip. A slow, cold smile began to spread across my face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey willfully walk into a steel trap. "She is not baiting me, Marcus," I replied, smoothing out the crease he had made in the paper. "She is digging her own grave, and she just sent me the coordinates." Marcus frowned, the anger in his face slowly giving way to a deep, cautious curiosity. He knew that look. He knew what happened when the founder of Apex Forensics stopped being a wife and started being an executioner. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low rumble. I tapped the edge of the gold foil invitation against the marble countertop. "This gala is their last lifeline. Their accounts are frozen, and their political backers are getting nervous. They are going to use this ballroom to solicit emergency cash off the books. They need this night to project strength. They need the elite to believe they are still kings and queens." I turned away from the kitchen and walked down the long corridor toward my hidden server room. Marcus followed close behind me, the heavy silence of the penthouse amplifying the tension in the air. I pushed open the door and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on the bookshelf. The heavy mechanical locks disengaged, and the wooden shelves slid silently to the left, revealing the glowing blue heart of my command center. The servers hummed their aggressive, chilling song. I stepped into the room and took my seat in the ergonomic leather chair. The 6 ultra-wide monitors woke up instantly, bathing my face in sharp digital light. I placed Brittany's handwritten note right next to my keyboard. If we let the FBI take them quietly, they get to hide behind their high-priced lawyers, I said, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keys. They will issue press releases claiming a misunderstanding. They will drag the legal process out for years. They will spin a narrative that they are victims of a political witch hunt. I am not going to allow that. They called me a parasite. They called me a peasant. They tried to destroy my daughter. I looked up at Marcus. The soft, dutiful woman he had married was completely gone. I am going to the gala. I stated the absolute certainty in my voice, leaving no room for debate. And I am bringing a nuclear weapon. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, leaning against the doorframe. A slow, proud smile broke through his stoic expression. Build it, he said. I cracked my knuckles and unleashed my hands across the keyboard. The keystrokes sounded like rapid automatic fire in the chilled air of the server room. I did not just want to expose them. I wanted a theatrical massacre. I wanted an event so catastrophic and undeniable that the Wilson and Hayes names would be permanently burned into the ashes of Atlanta's history. The gala was being held at the Grand Biltmore Hotel, an architectural masterpiece downtown with state-of-the-art audio-visual systems. I opened a backdoor portal into the Biltmore's central network infrastructure. It took me less than 12 minutes to bypass their archaic commercial firewalls. I mapped the entire digital grid of the grand ballroom. I isolated the control protocols for the massive projection screens, the surround sound audio array, and the digital donor bidding system that ran on every table in the room. Then I began to build the payload. I created a dormant Trojan horse program and injected it directly into the Biltmore's master server. It was designed to remain completely invisible, a silent ghost waiting in the wires. I opened my encrypted federal vault and began dragging the darkest, most devastating files I had acquired over the past week into the payload. I uploaded the raw, unedited audio files of Brittany screaming at Corinne, confessing to extorting Jamal and embezzling millions from the HBCU charity. I uploaded the high-resolution bank statements from the Cayman Island black safe. I uploaded the signed federal documents proving Senator Hayes had taken bribes from offshore cartels to fund his political action committees. I uploaded the fake DNA test receipts proving Corinne had attempted to frame Marcus with a fraudulent scandal. I linked every single file to a master sequencing code. The payload was heavy dense with enough criminal evidence to put their entire bloodline in a federal penitentiary for the next 3 lifetimes. Next, I targeted the gala's financial infrastructure. The event utilized an app-based bidding system for the silent auction and charity donations. I wrote a custom override script and spliced it into the app's source code. When the payload was triggered, the app would completely lock down. It would freeze every transaction in the room, preventing Corinne and Brittany from laundering a single dollar of emergency capital from their wealthy friends. I spent the next 4 hours refining the code, perfecting the timing, locking the execution protocols behind a military-grade encryption key that only I possessed. I worked with a cold, ruthless efficiency. Every time I glanced at Brittany's handwritten note, the fire in my chest burned a little hotter. She wanted me to clear the tables. I was going to clear the entire room. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the server room, the weapon was complete. I transferred the primary trigger mechanism onto a sleek encrypted flash drive that was no larger than a tube of lipstick. I pulled it from the console, holding the cold metal in the palm of my hand. The entire legacy of the Hayes and Wilson families was trapped inside this tiny drive, waiting for me to press the button. Marcus walked up behind me, resting his heavy hands gently on my shoulders. He looked at the 6 monitors, which were now displaying a simple blinking prompt awaiting execution. "Is it ready?" he asked, his voice quiet, reverent. "It is," I replied, slipping the flash drive into my pocket. "They have absolutely no idea what is coming for them," Marcus said, staring at the screen. I turned my chair around to face him. I looked up into the eyes of the man who had loved me, protected me, and stood by me when his entire family tried to tear us apart. Brittany invited a peasant to a palace. I said, my voice deadly calm. She wanted to remind me of my place, but she forgot one crucial detail about people who clean up messes. I stood up, closing the distance between us. We know exactly where all the dirt is hidden. I walked past Marcus, leaving the glowing server room behind. The gala was exactly 48 hours away. It was time to find the perfect dress. If I was going to execute the elite of Atlanta, I was going to do it looking like a queen. The red silk draped over my shoulders like a second skin. I had chosen the gown with absolute precision. It was not a dress meant to blend in with the muted conservative tones of Atlanta high society. It was a floor-length, blood-red masterpiece with a plunging neckline and a dramatic sweeping train. It was the color of a warning. It was the color of a reckoning. I paired it with a single diamond pendant and a matching pair of stiletto heels that echoed like a gavel striking wood with every step I took. Marcus wore a midnight blue bespoke tuxedo that perfectly complemented his broad shoulders and commanding presence. When I stepped out of our bedroom and into the soft light of the penthouse hallway, he stopped entirely. His eyes swept over me, and a slow, intensely proud smile broke across his face. He extended his arm and I took it, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of him beside me. We rode the private elevator down to the garage in silence. Words were no longer necessary. We were two soldiers stepping onto a battlefield, and we already knew exactly how the war was going to end. The drive to the Grand Biltmore Hotel was swift. As our sleek black town car pulled into the circular driveway, the scene outside was a chaotic blur of flashing cameras and valet attendants. The Atlanta Heritage Foundation Autumn Gala was the crown jewel of the social season, and the local press was out in full force. I stepped out of the car, the cool evening air washing over my bare shoulders. Marcus placed his hand firmly on the small of my back, guiding me toward the grand entrance. The moment we crossed the threshold, the sensory overload of extreme generational wealth hit me. The Biltmore lobby smelled of expensive orchids and imported champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner, nearly drowned out by the low hum of hundreds of wealthy patrons exchanging fake pleasantries. We checked our coats and made our way toward the massive double doors of the grand ballroom. I paused just outside the entrance, taking a slow, deep breath. My fingers brushed the smooth fabric of my evening bag, feeling the hard metallic shape of the flash drive hidden inside. The nuclear payload was ready. We stepped into the ballroom. The space was breathtaking, a cavernous hall lined with towering marble columns and illuminated by three massive crystal chandeliers that cast a brilliant golden glow over the sea of attendees. Round tables covered in crisp white linen and heavy silver centerpieces filled the floor. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets glided silently through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and caviar. The elite of the city were all here. I saw banking executives, state senators, real estate tycoons, and media moguls. They were a sea of black tuxedos and navy blue gowns, a collective uniform of old money and quiet power. And then there was me. My red gown cut through the muted colors of the room like a flare in the dark. The reaction was instantaneous. As Marcus and I began to walk down the center aisle toward the front of the room, the conversation closest to us faltered. Heads turned. Glasses hovered halfway to lips. The whispers started as a low murmur and quickly rippled outward, spreading through the ballroom like a virus. I kept my chin high, my expression completely unbothered. I could feel the hostile judging glares of the women who had ignored me for 7 years. I could feel the shock of the men who only knew me as Marcus' quiet, unremarkable wife. They parted for us, an involuntary physical reaction to the sheer authority radiating from Marcus and the unapologetic defiance of my entrance. We claimed a standing position near one of the large floral displays, just to the left of the main stage. I scanned the room with the clinical eye of an auditor. I did not just see wealthy socialites. I saw the panic hiding beneath their expensive jewelry. I saw Senator Hayes standing near the bar, laughing too loudly, while aggressively gripping a glass of bourbon. His face was flushed, and his eyes were darting nervously around the room. He knew his political action committees had been frozen that morning. He was bleeding out, and he was using this party to beg for emergency cash off the books. Then I looked at the stage. Corinne and Brittany were holding court near the podium, radiating a desperate artificial confidence. Corinne wore a heavy emerald green gown, her neck draped in diamonds that were likely heavily mortgaged. Brittany stood beside her in a severe black dress, her posture rigid and her eyes scanning the crowd with predatory focus. Jamal was standing slightly behind them, sweating profusely and looking like a man marching toward the gallows. He kept tugging at his collar, clearly terrified that his mother and his wife, who now knew the absolute truth about his embezzling and his mistress, were going to turn on him at any moment. But Corinne and Brittany had a script to follow. They needed to project total unity to keep their donors opening their wallets. A sharp chime echoed through the ballroom sound system, calling the room to attention. The string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded into expectant silence as Corinne stepped up to the microphone. "Welcome, friends, esteemed guests, and cherished partners." Corinne began, her voice projecting smooth and practiced over the speakers. She gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward to capture the audience. "Tonight we gather not just to celebrate the history of the Atlanta Heritage Foundation, but to secure its future. For decades, the Wilson and Hayes families have stood as pillars of this great city, dedicated to philanthropy, excellence, and above all else, family loyalty." A polite round of applause rippled through the room. Corinne smiled, a tight, strained expression that did not reach her eyes. "Legacy is a heavy burden," she continued, her tone shifting to something more solemn. "It requires sacrifice, it requires unyielding dedication, and it requires knowing who can carry the torch forward when the storms gather. Recently, our family has faced internal challenges. We have endured the painful realization that not everyone who shares our blood shares our values." The crowd went completely still. Every person in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. Eyes darted toward Marcus and me. Corinne was taking her shot. She was using this massive public platform to formally excommunicate my husband. "Some choose to walk away from their responsibilities," Corinne said, staring directly at Marcus over the heads of the crowd. "Some choose paths of selfishness, marrying into mediocrity, and turning their backs on the very institution that raised them. We pity those choices. We mourn the loss of their potential. But the Wilson legacy does not stop for those who cannot keep up." She turned and extended a hand toward Jamal. "That is why tonight I am profoundly proud to announce the future of our family enterprise. My son Jamal Wilson, along with his brilliant and devoted wife Brittany, will be taking over as the sole managing directors of the Wilson estate and the primary custodians of our historically Black colleges and universities scholarship fund. They are the true heirs of this dynasty. They understand loyalty. They understand honor." Jamal stepped forward, forcing a weak, trembling smile as he took his mother's hand. The applause that followed was loud and enthusiastic. The room was buying the performance. They were buying the lie. Brittany stepped up to the second microphone, preparing to deliver her portion of the rehearsed speech. She looked out over the sea of wealthy donors, her face glowing with arrogant triumph. She thought she had won. She thought the temporary freezing of their assets was a glitch they could negotiate their way out of. She believed that by publicly naming Jamal the sole heir and humiliating Marcus, she had secured her grip on the throne. And then her eyes landed on me. Brittany's voice caught in her throat. The practiced smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated fury. Her hands gripped the microphone stand, her knuckles turning white. She stared at the brilliant red silk of my dress, realizing exactly what I had done. I had taken her venomous invitation, her demand that I come clean the tables, and I had thrown it back in her face. I had invaded her sanctuary looking like I owned the building. The silence stretched on for a fraction of a second too long. The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably as Brittany stood frozen, glaring down at me. I did not break eye contact. I tilted my head slightly, offering her a small, chilling smile. Brittany quickly recovered, leaning away from the microphone and whispering frantically to Corinne. Corinne's eyes snapped toward me, her face draining of color. She looked terrified. She remembered the morning. She remembered that I was the woman who had just hijacked the land beneath her precious academy. Brittany did not hesitate. She turned toward the side of the stage and made a sharp, aggressive hand signal to the event security team. Instantly, three massive men wearing dark suits and earpieces detached themselves from the walls and began navigating through the crowded ballroom directly toward us. They moved with heavy, forceful determination, pushing past the socialites and donors. Marcus saw them coming. He shifted his stance, moving slightly in front of me, his broad frame creating an impenetrable barrier. I stepped right back up to his side, refusing to be hidden. The lead security guard, a tall man with a thick neck and a permanent scowl, stopped 2 feet away from us. He leaned in, his voice low and threatening. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," the guard said, crossing his arms. "You are not on the approved guest list for this evening. The hosts have requested that you leave the premises immediately. If you do not comply, we will be forced to physically escort you out of the ballroom." The surrounding guests stepped back, giving us a wide berth. The tension in our corner of the room was thick enough to choke on. Corinne and Brittany were watching from the stage, waiting for me to be dragged out like common trash. They wanted the spectacle. They wanted the elite of Atlanta to watch me lose. Marcus let out a low, menacing chuckle. His eyes locked onto the lead guard, daring the man to take a single step closer. "You are not going to lay a hand on my wife," Marcus said, his voice vibrating with danger. I placed my hand gently on Marcus' forearm, calming him. I looked at the security guard, maintaining my serene smile. "We are not leaving," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly projected, carrying just far enough for the surrounding socialites to hear. "In fact, we are just getting started." I slowly opened my evening bag and pulled out the small metallic flash drive. I held it up, letting the crystal light catch the edge of it. Brittany could see it from the stage. She did not know exactly what it was, but the sheer panic in her eyes confirmed that she knew it was a weapon. I looked back at the security guard. "Tell Mrs. Hayes that I brought the cleaning supplies she requested," I said, "and tell her to look at the screens." I did not wait for the security guard to process my words. I stepped around his massive frame, moving with a swift, predatory grace that caught him completely off guard. Marcus moved in perfect synchronization, stepping into the guard's path and blocking him with a silent, immovable stance. The guard hesitated, looking at Marcus' broad shoulders and cold, unyielding eyes. That single second of hesitation was all I needed. I walked up the carpeted stairs to the main stage. The heavy red silk of my gown swept across the floor like a spreading fire. Corinne and Brittany stood paralyzed at the podium, their eyes wide with a mixture of outrage and genuine terror. They had spent their entire lives operating under the assumption that their wealth insulated them from consequences. They had never faced someone who simply did not care about their rules. I reached the podium and smoothly stepped between them. Corinne opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. I snatched the microphone directly from her trembling hand. With my other hand, I took the encrypted flash drive and drove it into the primary USB port on the master audiovisual console built into the side of the podium. I tapped a single command on the touchscreen. Instantly, the three massive projection screens behind the stage flickered. The golden crest of the Atlanta Heritage Foundation vanished. In its place, a stark, high-resolution image of an official medical document materialized, casting a harsh white glow over the stage. The murmurs in the ballroom ceased entirely. A suffocating, dead silence fell over the hundreds of billionaires and politicians in the room. "Corinne Wilson loves to talk about legacy," I said, my voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing off the marble columns. "She loves to preach about honor, dedication, and the burden of the family name. But the truth is that the Wilson legacy is built on a foundation of pathological lies and profound cowardice." I gestured toward the massive screens. "Please direct your attention to the records currently displayed." I continued, my tone clinical and completely devoid of mercy. "These are official sealed medical documents from Atlanta General Hospital dated exactly 14 years ago. They detail an emergency surgery performed on Marcus Wilson following a severe physical trauma. The documents clearly state that the extent of the injury required a full and irreversible vasectomy. Marcus has been completely sterile since he was 20 years old." A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom, the sound of hundreds of wealthy patrons suddenly processing the implication of those medical records was like a sudden rush of wind. I saw glasses lower. I saw mouths drop open in shock. 7 years ago, this very society was entertained by a scandalous narrative, I said, pacing slowly across the front of the stage. A young woman named Chloe came forward pregnant and terrified. Corinne Wilson stood before her peers and publicly declared that Marcus was the father. She branded Marcus as reckless and irresponsible. She used that manufactured scandal to publicly humiliate him, to strip him of his voting rights in the family trust, and to clear the path to anoint Jamal as the unquestioned golden heir of the Wilson empire. I tapped the console screen again. The medical records vanished, replaced by a crisp, undeniably authentic DNA paternity report. The name at the top of the report was highlighted in bright yellow: Jamal Wilson. The probability of paternity read 99.9%. It was not just a betrayal, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air. It was a spectacular, meticulously coordinated scam covered up by Corinne herself. Jamal was the father of Chloe's child. Jamal was the one who had been reckless. But Corinne could not stomach the truth. She looked down on Chloe. She despised the fact that Chloe was a working-class woman of color from the south side of the city. Corinne's own internalized prejudice and elitism could not fathom her precious golden boy being tied to someone she deemed socially inferior. I turned to look directly at Corinne, who was now gripping the podium to keep herself from collapsing. Her face was ashen, completely drained of blood. She looked like a ghost trapped in the harsh light of her own destruction. Corinne orchestrated the entire lie. I continued, ensuring every syllable resonated through the room. She paid off clinic workers. She threatened Chloe into silence. She forced Marcus to take the fall, sacrificing his reputation and his standing in this community just to protect Jamal. She needed Jamal's record to remain spotless so he could be paired with someone suitable, someone wealthy, someone like Brittany Hayes who could merge their political and financial capital. I shifted my gaze to Brittany. She was standing frozen, her severe black dress blending into the shadows of the stage. Her eyes were locked onto the massive screen, reading the paternity test results over and over again, as if trying to force the letters to change. The realization was hitting her like a physical blow. Her entire marriage, the foundation of her social standing, and her alliance with the Wilson family was built on a pathetic, cowardly lie. Brittany slowly turned her head to look at Jamal. Jamal was sweating profusely. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He took a step backward, shaking his head, holding his hands up in a weak, defensive gesture. "Brittany!" he stammered, his voice cracking over the microphone, picking up his pathetic whisper. "Brittany, I can explain. My mother, she told me to keep quiet. It was for the family." Brittany's face contorted into a mask of pure, absolute revulsion. She looked at the man she had married, the man she had just proudly announced as the sole managing director of their future, and she saw nothing but a spineless fraud. "You sickening coward, Brittany!" hissed her voice, trembling with a rage so deep it seemed to shake her entire frame. The ballroom was in total uproar now. The polite silence of high society had completely shattered. Investors were pulling out their phones, frantically texting their brokers. Politicians were backing away from the stage, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Wilson and Hayes families. The carefully curated image of their philanthropic dynasty was burning to ash right in front of their eyes. Corinne finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, desperate shriek. "Turn it off!" she screamed, lunging toward the console. "Turn those screens off right now! This is defamation! This is illegal!" I easily sidestepped her frantic grab, placing myself between her and the console. "I am a federal forensic auditor, Corinne," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch meant only for her and Brittany. "I do not deal in defamation. I deal in verifiable, undeniable facts. And the fact is, you are standing on a stage paid for by dirty money, wearing diamonds bought with stolen funds, protecting a son who is a fraud." I looked out over the chaotic ballroom. The security guards who had tried to remove me were now standing near the edge of the stage, unsure of what to do. They were paid to protect the hosts, but the hosts were currently self-destructing on live microphones. Marcus stood at the bottom of the stairs, his hands casually resting in his pockets, watching me with a look of absolute unyielding pride. I picked up the microphone one last time, bringing it to my lips. The room slowly quieted down, eager to consume every last drop of the scandal. "You invited me here tonight to clear the tables. I said, my gaze sweeping over the crowd before locking back onto Brittany and Corinne. Consider them cleared. Your lies are exposed. Your legacy is a joke, and your reign over this city is permanently over. I dropped the microphone onto the wooden stage. The heavy thud echoed through the speakers, a final, definitive punctuation mark to the end of their era. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on Corinne, who was now sobbing uncontrollably, and Brittany, who was staring at Jamal with murderous intent. I walked down the stairs, my red dress trailing behind me like a victory banner. Marcus extended his arm, and I took it perfectly in sync. We walked back down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The crowd parted for us instantly, but this time there were no hostile glares. There was only shock, fear, and absolute respect. We walked out of the Biltmore Hotel, leaving the ruins of the Wilson and Hayes Empire smoldering in our wake, stepping out into the cool, clean night air. At least that was the plan. My hand had barely touched the heavy brass handle of the main exit when a shrill, desperate shriek echoed from the ballroom, carrying all the way down the grand foyer. Corinne Wilson was not finished. Her pride, a grotesque and mutated thing, refused to let me have the final word. She could not bear the thought of a woman she deemed beneath her walking away victorious. I stopped. Marcus stopped beside me, a low, dangerous sigh escaping his lips. He did not pull me toward the door. He simply dropped his hand from the brass handle and turned to face the ballroom entrance. We walked back down the plush, carpeted hallway, stepping back into the cavernous space sparkling with crystal lights. Corinne was gripping the podium so hard the microphone stand was shaking. The remaining guests had frozen in place, unwilling to miss a single second of the spectacle. "You think you can just walk away?" Corinne screamed, her voice echoing harshly against the marble columns. "You think a few doctored medical records and some baseless accusations can destroy us? We are the Wilson family. We built this city. You are nothing but a poor, pathetic brat who manipulated my son." I walked slowly down the center aisle, the sea of wealthy donors parting for me once again. The red silk of my gown swept across the floor like a spreading fire. I did not rush. I let the sharp, rhythmic strike of my stiletto heels fill the heavy silence of the room. I reached the front of the stage, looking up at Corinne and Brittany. Brittany was hyperventilating, her eyes darting nervously toward the front row where her father, Senator Hayes, was standing with his arms tightly crossed. I did not take the microphone from Corinne. I simply tapped the control application on my phone, syncing it to the master audiovisual console I had hacked earlier. "You are right, Corinne," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, without the need for a microphone. "I did manipulate the screens, but I am not finished displaying the truth." I pressed a button on my screen. The massive digital display behind them flashed instantly, replacing the paternity test with a complex series of offshore banking ledgers. The headers on the documents were unmistakable. They bore the official crest of the Atlanta Heritage Foundation Historically Black Colleges and Universities Scholarship Fund. Right next to those ledgers were routing numbers matching a private Cayman Islands account. Brittany let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. "Let us talk about your flawless daughter-in-law, Corinne," I announced, projecting my voice so every billionaire and politician in the room could hear me perfectly. Brittany did not just marry Jamal to secure a political alliance. She needed capital to fund her offshore investments. She needed a slush fund. And she found a very convenient one sitting right here in your pristine foundation. I pointed at the screen. Over the past 4 years, Brittany Hayes has systematically embezzled $3.5 million from the HBCU Charity Fund. She diverted scholarship money meant for underprivileged students directly into her private shell companies. The exact same companies that the federal government froze this morning. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Embezzling from a charity was the ultimate unforgivable sin in high society. It was not just illegal, it was incredibly bad for optics. I turned my attention to the front row, locking eyes with Senator Hayes. The man had built his entire political platform on educational reform and community upliftment. Now the evidence of his daughter's thievery was projected 50 feet high for all of his major donors to see. "Senator Hayes." I called out, my tone dripping with false polite concern. "I assume you were unaware that your re-election campaigns were being indirectly funded by stolen scholarship money." The Federal Bureau of Investigation certainly found the routing numbers fascinating when I forwarded them this morning. Senator Hayes turned ashen. He looked up at the screen, then looked at Brittany, who was now weeping openly on the stage, reaching her hands out toward him. "Daddy, please," Brittany sobbed, her voice cracking. "I can explain. It was just a temporary transfer. I was going to put it back." Senator Hayes did not say a word. He looked at his daughter with an expression of absolute profound disgust. He knew his political career was hanging by a microscopic thread. To associate with her now was political suicide. He slowly took a step backward, shaking his head. Then he turned his back completely on the stage and began walking briskly toward the exit, abandoning his daughter to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. Brittany collapsed onto her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, her severe black dress pooling around her on the wooden stage. She had lost her husband, her money, and now her father. Corinne, however, was entirely devoid of shame. She stepped over Brittany, ignoring her weeping daughter-in-law completely. Corinne's eyes were wild, practically glowing with a manic delusion. She gripped the microphone, leaning over the edge of the stage. "You think this changes anything?" Corinne Gauthet, her voice raw and breaking. "So Brittany is a thief, and Jamal made a mistake. It does not matter. You are still just a peasant trying to play a game you do not understand. I am still the head of this family. I sit on the board of the Vanguard Trust. This family possesses generational wealth. Our core assets are untouchable. You cannot touch our trust funds. You cannot touch our estates. We will weather this storm and we will crush you into the dirt where you belong." I stood perfectly still, letting her manic tirade wash over me. I waited until she ran out of breath, until the only sound in the room was her heavy panting and Brittany's muffled sobs. I cham book walking up the 3 short stairs to the side of the stage. I stepped right up to the podium, forcing Corinne to take a step back. I leaned closely into the microphone, ensuring my voice was low, smooth, and absolutely lethal. "Do you remember 4 years ago, Corinne?" I asked, the question echoing softly through the crystal-lit hall. "Do you remember when the Wilson Family Trust was completely over-leveraged? When your bad real estate investments in commercial districts nearly bankrupted the entire bloodline?" Corinne's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face. "You were desperate," I continued, my voice wrapping around the silent ballroom like a velvet cord. "You begged every bank in Atlanta for a loan, and they all turned you down. But then a miracle happened. An anonymous shell company out of Delaware pumped $20 million of liquid capital into the Wilson Trust. They saved you from foreclosure. They saved your mansions and your cars. You have spent the last 4 years bragging about that anonymous benefactor, using their backing to secure even more credit." Corinne's chest was heaving, her breathing shallow. "What does that have to do with anything?" she whispered defensively. I reached into the small hidden pocket of my red silk gown. I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of thick archival paper. I unfolded it deliberately, letting the tension stretch until the entire room felt like it was going to shatter. "I want you to guess who signed that $20 million check, Corinne," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I threw the company ownership certificate onto the table. The heavy paper slid across the polished mahogany of the podium, stopping perfectly in front of Corinne's trembling hands. The entire hall held its breath. Corinne looked down at the paper. It was the official corporate registration and ownership certificate for the Delaware Shell Company. Her eyes scanned the legal text, searching for the authorized signature at the bottom of the page. When she saw the name, her entire body went rigid, as if she had been struck by lightning. The name on the certificate was Nia Wilson. "I own the Shell Company, Corinne," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. "I am the anonymous benefactor. I bought your debt. I hold the primary lien on the Wilson Family Trust, which means I own your houses. I own your cars. I own the very shoes you are wearing tonight. You have absolutely nothing left. You are bankrupt. And I am calling in the loan tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The woman who had called me unworthy, the woman who had spent 7 years treating me like a disease, finally realized the truth. The peasant she had mocked was the master of her entire universe. The unworthy party is the creditor who holds 100% of the entire family's assets. Corinne's knees gave out. She collapsed against the podium, a hollow, broken sound escaping her lips as the reality of her total, absolute destruction finally set in. She was nothing. I turned away from the podium, leaving the microphone behind. Marcus was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, his hand extended. I placed my hand in his, the warmth of his grip grounding me. We did not look back at the crying women on the stage or the terrified billionaires in the crowd. We walked out of the Biltmore Hotel together, stepping into the night, our victory absolute. The flashing blue and red lights of the Atlanta Police Department cruisers painted the exterior of the Biltmore Hotel long before Marcus and I even reached our waiting town car. We stood silently by the open door of our vehicle, watching as a coordinated task force of federal agents and local police swarmed the grand entrance. The anonymous tip I had sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission included irrefutable, unencrypted evidence of wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. They did not wait for Monday morning. They moved with the swift, brutal efficiency reserved for high-profile financial criminals. From the comfort of our leather seats, we watched the final act of the gala unfold. Jamal was led out. First, his hands cuffed behind his back, his midnight blue tuxedo jacket ripped at the shoulder. He was weeping openly, his face slick with sweat and tears, babbling incoherently to the stoic federal agents pulling him toward an unmarked vehicle. Brittany followed moments later. She was not crying. She was screaming violently, thrashing against the officers, gripping her arms, cursing Jamal's name, her father's name, and the entire Wilson bloodline. Her severe black dress was tangled around her knees, and her pristine socialite facade was completely, entirely gone. We drove away into the quiet night, leaving the ashes of their empire behind us. The next morning, the sun rose over our private estate, casting a brilliant, warm light across the sprawling, manicured lawns. The air inside our home was thick with the rich scent of freshly brewed espresso and the quiet, peaceful hum of genuine security. I stood at the marble kitchen island wearing a simple white silk robe, holding a warm mug between my hands. Marcus sat at the breakfast table, reading the morning Financial Times on his tablet. The headlines were already dominated by the spectacular implosion of the Atlanta Heritage Foundation and the subsequent arrests of its primary directors. At precisely 9:15 in the morning, the secure intercom system connected to our front gates chimed softly. Marcus tapped the screen, bringing up the high-definition security feed. We both looked at the monitor. Standing outside the towering wrought iron gates of our estate was Corinne. She looked nothing like the terrifying, untouchable matriarch who had ruled Atlanta high society for 4 decades. She was still wearing the emerald green evening gown from the night before, but it was now wrinkled and stained. Her heavy diamond necklace was gone, likely seized by federal agents or pawned in a desperate late-night attempt to secure liquid cash. Her perfectly coiffed hair hung in lank, disorganized strands around her face, and her makeup was smeared into dark, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes. She was shivering in the crisp morning air, repeatedly pressing the buzzer with trembling fingers. "Let her in," I said, my voice perfectly calm, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Marcus pressed the release button. The heavy gate swung open, and Corinne began the long, exhausting walk up our winding driveway. She did not have a car. The bank acting on the foreclosure notices I had triggered at exactly 9 o'clock had already frozen. Her accounts immobilized her credit and seized the keys to the Wilson family fleet. She had walked or taken a taxi as far as her last few dollars would carry her. I set my mug down and walked out through the grand double doors of our foyer, stepping onto the sweeping stone portico. Marcus stood just inside the doorway, a silent, imposing guardian watching my back. Corinne reached the bottom of the stone steps and stopped. She looked up at me, breathing heavily, her chest heaving with exertion and pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at the expansive architecture of our home, the pristine landscaping, the undeniable evidence of the wealth Marcus and I had built entirely without her permission or her help. "Nia," she gasped, her voice raspy and broken. "Nia, please." She took a step up the stairs, her knees buckling slightly. And then the woman who had spent 7 years treating me like a disease, the woman who had forced my husband to bear the weight of her biological son's sins, completely surrendered. Corinne Wilson fell to her knees on the hard stone driveway. "Please," she sobbed, clasping her hands together in a gesture of absolute pathetic desperation. They took Jamal. They froze everything. I went to the manor this morning and the locks were changed. The security guards would not even let me pack a bag. "Nia, you cannot do this. You cannot take my home. It is all I have left. I am an old woman. You have made your point. You won. Please just give me back the primary estate. I beg of you." I looked down at her. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not feel anger either. I felt a profound clinical emptiness toward the woman groveling at my feet. I did not yell. I did not curse. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my silk robe and pulled out a neatly folded piece of white fabric. I shook it out, letting it unfold completely. It was a standard issue industrial kitchen apron, plain white with cheap cotton strings. "Do you remember this, Corinne?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly level. She stared at the apron, her tear-filled eyes wide with confusion. 5 years ago, I continued taking a slow, deliberate step down the stairs toward her. It was Thanksgiving. My daughter Zuri was only 4 years old. She ran into the main kitchen of your precious manor, looking for a glass of water. She was laughing. She was happy. And you grabbed her by the arm, pushed her out into the hallway, and told her she was dirtying your pristine floors. When I intervened, you threw this exact apron at my chest. You told me that if I was going to invade your home, I needed to make myself useful and act like the help. You told me I would never be anything more than the hired help in your eyes. Corinne's breath hitched in her throat. She remembered. I could see the horrifying realization dawning in her eyes. I casually tossed the white apron. It fluttered through the morning air and landed perfectly in the dirt, right at Corinne's trembling knees. "That house no longer belongs to the Wilson Family Trust," I said, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "It is now registered as a holding asset under my primary subsidiary corporation. I own the title, the land, the walls, and every piece of furniture inside it. However, I am not entirely without mercy." Corinne looked up, a desperate, fragile spark of hope igniting in her chest. "You can return to the manor." I stated, my tone devoid of any warmth. "But you will not be living in the master suite. You will not be hosting galas. There is a small windowless room in the basement next to the boiler. It was meant for the groundskeeper. You may live in that room. You will put on that apron, Corinne. You will scrub the floors you love so much. You will polish the silver you once paraded around. You will act as the live-in maid for the corporate executives I am leasing the estate out to starting next month." Corinne's mouth fell open, a silent scream of absolute horror trapped in her lungs. "Every minimum wage hour you work will be carefully logged and deducted from the $20 million you owe my company." I continued, my voice ringing with cold, unyielding authority. "You will work off your debt on your hands and knees. If you miss a spot, if you complain, or if you refuse to wear the uniform you provided me 5 years ago, my lawyers will have you physically removed from the property for trespassing." I took a step back up toward my front door, looking down at her one final time. "Pick up the apron, Corinne." I commanded, the words carrying the full weight of a master issuing an order to a servant. "Pick it up and walk to your new job, or leave my property right now and sleep on the streets of the city you thought you owned. The door is right behind you." I did not wait to see which choice she made. I turned my back on the sobbing, broken woman on the pavement, walked through the grand doors of my home, and let Marcus close them firmly behind us, shutting out the past forever. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the morning air, and the remnants of the Wilson dynasty outside. The absolute silence of our home wrapped around us, replacing the frantic, desperate sobs of a woman who had finally met her reckoning. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the last lingering trace of the past 7 years evaporate from my shoulders. Marcus placed a warm hand on the small of my back, guiding me away from the foyer and into the sunlit expanse of our living room. We moved together toward the massive plush sofa that faced the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the private grounds. I sank into the cushions and immediately rested my head against Marcus' solid shoulder. He wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close, his heartbeat a steady, comforting rhythm against my side. Outside the glass, our daughter Zuri was a blur of pure, joyous energy. She was sprinting across the manicured green lawn, chasing a brilliant yellow butterfly, her unrestrained laughter filtering faintly through the thick panes of glass. She was safe. She was loved. She would never know the cold, calculating cruelty of the people who had tried to erase us. I watched her twirl in the sunlight, and a profound sense of absolute peace washed over my spirit. Family is not defined by the people who happen to share your bloodline. It is certainly not defined by the people who smile at you in public while secretly waiting for the perfect moment to push you out the door. For 7 long years, Corinne and her circle looked down on me. They labeled me an outsider. They called me unworthy. They made it abundantly clear that I was never meant to sit at their pristine elite table. But they severely underestimated the quiet observation of someone forced into the shadows. They never realized that while they were busy guarding their empty legacy, I was meticulously dismantling it piece by piece. I did not just prove them wrong, I proved to them that the woman they deemed unworthy just bought the entire table. I bought the estate it sits in and the very financial lifelines they need to survive. Zuri caught the butterfly in her gaze, turning back to wave at us with a radiant smile. Marcus kissed the top of my head, pulling me just a fraction closer. The view slowly pulled back, taking in the warmth of the room, the security of my husband, and the joyous freedom of my child, leaving the darkness entirely behind us. The screen fades to black,